What's up guys, in this video we are going to be looking at integrating Laravel Sanctum single page application authentication with a Nuxt.js client. Now this is coming from questions that I received from students who took my course on Udemy, which I released last year about full stack API development in Laravel. And you can check out the course in the description of this video if you want. But basically, when the course was released, we didn't have Laravel Sanctum just yet. And so we used the Daemon JWT Auth Authentication package to do our API authentication. But since Laravel Sanctum was released, I've received many questions from students asking if I can produce a video to show them how to do this. So I just thought it would be a good idea to do this on YouTube instead and just make it free for everyone. Now, it is also a good idea in any case that you try to use as many first-party packages as possible if they can meet your needs before you start looking outside of the ecosystem of Laravel. So I find Laravel Sanctum really nice to use in this situation, which I'm going to demonstrate. To make one thing clear, we know that there are two really distinct ways of authenticating people with Laravel Sanctum. There is one which is issuing authentication tokens, which you would generally use for third-party applications that are authenticating to your API. And this basically issues tokens for each user when they are logged in, and these tokens are stored in the database, and those tokens have to be passed back to the API with every request that requires authentication. So this is basically a stateless authentication, and you would use it for clients that do not run on the same domain as your API. But there's also the single page application authentication, which basically uses the web authentication of Laravel. So in this case, you're actually creating a stateful authentication where a session is established in the back end and cookies are shared between your client and your API. Now, the prerequisite for using the single page application is that both your client and your API have to be on the same domain. So if they're on separate domains, of course, it won't work because we are talking about sharing cookies, and you can't share cookies across different domains. So we are going to be looking at the single page application in this case, where the Nuxt client application will be running on the same domain as the API. So let's quickly create a Laravel application here, and I'm going to demonstrate how to integrate that using the new Nuxt Auth package, which the version 5, which actually comes with a Laravel Sanctum provider. And that makes it really easy to handle the single page application authentication with Nuxt.js. We're also going to look at the middleware on the Nuxt side, how you can protect pages, and it's really easy to do when you're working with the Nuxt Auth package. So let's quickly set up a Laravel project here, and I'm just going to do that through Composer. And I'm going to call my API. Now, while that's loading, let me just add the folder to my workspace here. So now we do have a basic Laravel application set up here. And if we go to the front end, because I'm using Laravel Valet, I can just do api.test. So that's just the boilerplate that comes with Laravel. Let's start by actually setting up the database and some of the fundamental things. So the app URL in this case is api.test. And the URLs that we set here will end up being really important again, because we want to be able to share cookies between the Nuxt client and the API in the back end. And I've already created a database called Nuxt Auth, I think, with the password of password. Now let's quickly install Laravel Sanctum here. So if we just go to installation, all we need to do is pull in this Laravel Sanctum package via Composer. I'm just going to paste that here. While that's running, we are going to publish the configuration, which is really important. So we see the variables or the values that we need to configure in the back end. And I'm just going to do the migrations, or to run the migrations here, but we really don't need it in this case, because the migration that comes with Laravel Sanctum is the table to store the personal access tokens for users when they're using token-based authentication. But that's not really what we're doing here. Regardless of that, I'm just going to run the migrations here. It doesn't hurt to have that table, even though we're not going to be using it. So I'll quickly skip down to SPA authentication, and we follow the instructions here. The first thing is we want to pull in this middleware in our kernel file. And the middleware which says ensure front-end requests are stateful. This is basically the meat of Laravel Sanctum. When you try to do authentication, this is the middleware that does the check to see if the origin is coming from the same domain, and it channels the authentication to your Sanctum guard. So we are basically going to pull that into our kernel here on the app HTTP kernel, and we need to put that under the API middleware group here. Now let's go down and set up our cross-origin resource sharing. When you install Laravel, by the way, it comes with a CORS package out of the box. So from Laravel 7, I think this was introduced, or maybe 8. It comes with a CORS package pre-installed, and here we already have some paths or some URL paths that have been excluded from CORS policies, like all the API routes are going to be excluded from CORS, from cross-origin sharing blocks. And we also have the Sanctum cross-site request for the cookie endpoint, which is basically the endpoint that sets your CSRF token on your client side. So those are excluded from CORS policies out of the box. But really importantly here, we want to set the support credentials to true, because we want to be able to send credentials, cookies, and all of that from the front end to the back end, which means that we expect those credentials to be sent to the server from the client side. So to do that in the front end, when we are working with Axios, you'd have to also configure Axios to send the credentials by setting the with credentials entry here to true. We are going to look at that when we start working with Nuxt, but for now, that's all we need to do for the course. Let's also look at the Sanctum configurations, which we published. So the configuration here will not touch anything in the Sanctum configuration down here, but there's an entry here that says Sanctum stateful domains. And this is basically setting the domains that you want Laravel Sanctum to identify as stateful. And if a request is coming from a different origin than the stateful domains, then those requests will be rejected. So they will not be recognized. So we have to set that domain here. And in this case, the domain is going to be api.test port 3000. And the port 3000 here is because I'm using Nuxt.js, and by default, it's going to run on port 3000. So this is going to be the client domain, basically. Again, if you are using localhost and you have localhost here, then you need to set the domain for your client side here, which will probably be localhost port 3000. But in my case, I can do api.test port 3000 here because I'm running my application in Laravel Valley. The important thing is that your API and your client side domains should match. They should be the same. There's one more setting here, which is the session domain. And the session domain is actually set in your config sessions.php file. So if we go back to our configurations and we look at session.php, we can scroll down to the bottom somewhere or somewhere in the middle. There's a domain entry where you can set your session domain. So it says this will determine which domains the cookie is available to in your application. So let's copy that. And under session, we set that to api.test as well. Now, if you want this to target both your top level domain and any subdomains, you just put a period here. So it will be .api.test, but in this case, we don't have any subdomain, so I'm just going to leave it to api.test. So basically, that's all you need to do as far as setting up Laravel Sanctum is concerned. Now, we are going to be working with the API routes here. We are not going to be using any of the web routes. Even though the authentication is using the web guard, we are not going to be creating any web routes here. We're going to be doing everything in the API routes file. And when you install Laravel, of course, it comes with one endpoint in the API file, which is just the endpoint to get the currently authenticated user. But at the moment, this actually is using the Auth API middleware, but Laravel Sanctum comes with a different middleware called Auth Sanctum. So we need to set that middleware to Auth Sanctum instead of Auth API. Let's create a couple of other endpoints here to register the user. And I'm going to make the registration route here a get route. And the reason I'm making it a get route is the registration route is not really a Sanctum thing at all. So we are not going to be spending time creating a form just to register the user in the front end. So I'm just going to do the registration as a get so I can pass the credentials in the browser. So here we are going to get the request. And to register a user, of course, again, this is just a simple CRUD. So I'm just going to do create, and we'll take the name, the email, and we need the password. And we need to hash the password, of course. So I'm just going to use bcrypt, which is just a helper for hashing the password. And that's all we need for the user registration. Again, I'm not going to spend time doing any validation here. That's outside of the scope of Laravel Sanctum. So from the registration route, we're also going to have a login route. And for the login, this is going to be a post route because we're actually going to be posting the login credentials from the Nuxt client. So again, function request. And now the first thing we want to do is grab the credentials that we need to authenticate the user with. So it's going to be request only, email, and password. Then we need to check to see if we can authenticate the user with those credentials. So here we just say if we cannot authenticate the user with the given credentials. So if auth attempt, so if we are not able to authenticate with those credentials, then we simply throw a validation exception with messages. And we're going to store the message here under the key email, and we're just going to say invalid credentials. So let's pull in this exception class. Now, if they make it past this stage, it means that the credentials that the user sent in were correct. So we can actually go ahead and establish a session for that user. And that is quite easy because we just need to say request session regenerate and then return response. Just going to return a null with a 201 because we are creating a session. So I'm just going to say null 201. So what we're doing here is we are basically pulling the credentials, that's the email and the password, from the request that the user is sending through with the login. Then we're using those credentials to try and authenticate the user. So auth attempt is a method that comes with the authentication guard in Laravel. So auth attempt with the credentials, and if that fails, so we are negating this attempt. So if it fails, then we are throwing an exception, which is a validation exception that says invalid credentials. So this will basically be a 422 error. But if it doesn't, we simply regenerate an authenticated session for that user. Now let's also do a logout. And the logout again is going to be a post route. So route post, and we'll just call this logout. So function request. So the first thing is we use the auth guard, and I'm actually going to explicitly specify this to use the web guard, even though the web guard in this case is our default guard. So if you just say auth guard, it should go to the web guard, but I just like to be explicit sometimes when I'm actually working in the API file, just to make it clear that this is what we're using. And then we call the logout method on the auth guard. Then request session invalidate. So we invalidate the current authenticated session for that user. Then we also do request session regenerate token. So we are generating a new session, which is an unauthenticated session. So here, because we did auth attempt here, if it succeeded, then we are generating an authenticated session. And here we invalidate that authenticated session, and then we regenerate a new session for that user, which is unauthenticated, so which is a guest session basically. Then we can just do a return response JSON null and 200. So that's all there is as far as the routes that we're going to be using here goes. Now let's quickly go to the browser and register a user. Because we are using a get method for the registration route, we can basically just pass our registration credentials here. So here I'm just going to say API/register. So we are just passing the credentials here as a query string. So let's just run that. And it should have created the user, but we didn't return the user. So let's just say return user here, just to be sure that everything got created. So I'll go back and I'll just clear the user that got created in the database, just so we recreate that and actually see the user object. So let's create that again. And now we do see the user created in the database. So we have the name, the email, and the created and the timestamps. Alright, so that's all that we need to do as far as Laravel is concerned, or the API is concerned. Unless, well, when we start working with Nuxt, if we have any errors, we'll come back and look at it. But for now, this will do it for our API. And let's move on to create our client side, or the Nuxt application now. Now, to create our Nuxt application, we just go to the Nuxt documentation. It's pretty easy. You can use yarn, npx, or npm. And we just simply say npx create Nuxt app, or npm init and all of that. But I'm going to use npx here. So we are creating a basic Nuxt application. Npx create Nuxt app. And I'm going to call this client. I'm just going to leave the project name to client. We're going to use JavaScript, not TypeScript. And I'm working with npm, not yarn. Now you can choose a front-end framework here, or you can just do bare bones. But let's just go with Bootstrap View, so we can use some Bootstrap styling in the front end. It's not going to be anything fancy, but let's just make use of that. Now, very importantly here, you want to have Axios installed, because that's what the Auth or the Nuxt Auth Module will be using to send requests to the backend. And everything else here, we'll just leave it to default and say no, no. And we're going to be doing a server-side rendered app, so yes. And we then want a Git repo. And while that's installing, I'll also add that folder to my workspace. So let's get into the client directory. And if I just do npm run dev, we should have our client server, or the Nuxt application, spun up here on port 3000, which is the same port that we put in the API here under stateful domains. So this should be the domain that you have here in your .m file under Sanctum stateful domains. So you should match that. And if yours is not running on port 3000, put whatever port it's using in your client side. So let's go back here and we can just do api.test port 3000 to spin up our client application. Now again, I'm using api.test here because I'm using Laravel Valet, so I can just use the same domain with port 3000. But if you're not using Laravel Valet, this is very important. Your front end and your back end should be running on the same domain. So if you're using localhost, this should say localhost port 3000, and maybe your Laravel application is running on localhost port 8000. So our Nuxt installation is working, but let's just go quickly and set up the Nuxt Auth Module. When I created my course, Laravel Sanctum did not exist yet. So this package did not yet provide a way to authenticate with Laravel Sanctum. But with the current version, which is version 5, we do have a new provider called Laravel Sanctum, which is what we are going to be using here. And this is the cookie-based authentication for Laravel Sanctum. So we are going to be installing this package and using that Laravel Sanctum provider here to get our authentication working. So let's start here by quickly pulling in the package, and make sure that you are pulling in the Auth Next version. If you're using an older version, you won't have this provider, which means that what we're doing here will not really make sense to you and it will not work. So let's pull that in. I'm just going to kill my server here and run that. And while that is working, normally we would have to also install Axios, but we already chose to install Axios when we generated the Nuxt application. So we don't need to run this again. But if you did not choose to install Axios, then you'd have to install this Nuxt Axios module. And now let's dive into the configuration for the Nuxt package. So this is all done in the Nuxt config.js file. The first thing is we need to pull in the module that we just installed in our packages. So in here, we did install the Nuxt Auth, which is the next version. So we need to pull that in, and I'm just going to get rid of some of these comments. Then we need to create an authentication section, which is where we are going to configure how the Nuxt Auth package authenticates users, how it retrieves users, and all of that information. So let's come back to the providers and we just click on Laravel Sanctum and we see the basic configuration for Laravel Sanctum. Basically, you can define multiple strategies and use multiple strategies to log in. So if you wanted to log in with Facebook, Google, all of that, you can configure them as different strategies in here. So in our case, we only need to put in the Laravel Sanctum strategy. So I'm just going to copy the strategies part there. And in the auth entry here, I'm going to paste that. So we have the entry called Laravel Sanctum. The provider is Laravel Sanctum. And the domain or the URL here is the base domain of your Laravel API. So here it's going to be http api.test. We also need to configure a couple of endpoints. So the endpoints that will be used to log the user in, to log them out, or to retrieve the currently authenticated user. Now, there are some defaults that come with the Nuxt Auth package, which you can see by going to the GitHub repository for the Auth module. So if you go to the repository here and you look at providers, you can see the providers that are currently supported. And if we click on Laravel Sanctum, you can see the default values for the configuration. So the strategy is here. It's called Laravel Sanctum. And we do have some endpoints which we need to configure, but these are the default values that come with it. So we have endpoints for the cross-site request forgery, which is the Sanctum CSRF cookie, and we are not changing this, but we need to set the login, logout, and the user credentials. All we need to set in here are the URL values because we already have some defaults, and the defaults here are going to be the credentials that is going to send through, because remember that here we did say that you need to set the with credentials in Axios to true. So this package already handles that for us. We don't need to do it anymore. So it already sets the with credentials to true. It sets some of the headers that we need, like the content type and the accept headers and all of that. So all of that is already handled. Now we are going to change the login, the logout routes to actually match what we have configured in our API. So here, let's just say endpoints. And the first one we want to do is login. And the URL for login is going to be API login. Of course, you could also just put the base URL here to API and then just put the login part here if you prefer. It's all up to you. The value that you enter here is relative to that base URL because it will be appended to that base URL. So that's the login route. Let's do the logout, and that's just going to be logout. And let's do the user, and that's going to be user. That's the same as the default. So if you leave this out, it will still work because that's actually the default looking at the configuration here in the GitHub repo. Now, there's more options that you can provide here, like the user object. If you're returning a user in using, let's say, API resource in Laravel, you know that the data is usually wrapped in a data object. The response is wrapped in a data object. So this is to set what property may be wrapping your user object. In this case, we are not wrapping the user in anything. We are just retrieving the raw user information from our API. So if you look at our routes file here, you see that in the endpoint to get the currently authenticated user, we are just returning the user. So we are not wrapping that in any data object. But if you decided to wrap this as an array in a data object, then you need to provide that property name here. In our case, this is going to be false because we are really not using any wrappers for the response. Now, outside of your strategies, there are a couple of redirects that I want to set here, and these are not peculiar to the provider here. They are just general settings for the Nuxt Auth Module, which basically tells the module how to redirect users based on actions that they are taking or pages that they are visiting. So let's start with the login redirect. So here, I'm just going to say login, and this is the route that where users will be redirected to if they are trying to visit a page that requires authentication. So if a user is not authenticated and they are trying to visit, let's say, an edit profile page, which is supposed to be an authenticated route, then they should be redirected to this login page. So this is the route that they would be redirected to if they are visiting any protected route. We also want the logout route, and I'm just going to say a slash to the home page, and this is the path that the user will go to after the logout of the current page, if the current page is authenticated. So if the user is on their dashboard and the dashboard requires authentication and they click on the logout button from that dashboard, then they need to be kicked out of that dashboard and sent somewhere. So this is basically where they will be sent to. So they will be sent to the home page. But if they were on a page that is public, that doesn't require authentication, then they won't be redirected to any route. So they will just stay there. Now we also need a home page, which in this case again will just be a dot with a /. You may think that this is the home page of your application, but no, this is actually the page where you want to redirect users when they log into the application. So once they click on login, question is, where do you want to send them? So if you wanted them to go to their dashboard once they log in, then you'd actually change this to dashboard instead of just the /. But in our case, I just want to keep that to a /. So far, that is the configuration that we need to do in the Nuxt config file for the Sanctum provider. Now let's come over and create a couple of pages. And the reason I really love Nuxt.js so much is it comes with all these bells and whistles. I don't have to configure a router file here and specify my routes manually. I can just create my routes based on the page structure here. So let's create a couple of routes. I'm going to create a login page. I'm going to create, let's say, a dashboard page. And I think those 3 pages should be okay. So we are going to use the dashboard here just to illustrate a page that a user has to be signed in before they can visit. So let's come over to our template on the index page here. I'm just going to get rid of everything in here and let's build this template from scratch. Even the styles here, I'm just going to clean them out. Because we are using Bootstrap View, we have access to a couple of components. So if you don't know what it is, you can just go to Bootstrap View, enter, and you see a bunch of components. So every component that you have in Bootstrap, it's been converted into a view component basically, and we are using them here. So let's say we need a container. I'm just going to say b row, and in b row I'm just going to say b column. Cost will be 6, so I just want 6 column white here, and let's just set a class of mx auto to centralize that. And let's do a cat with the title of home. So actually, let me just say public home page. So it's clear that this is a page that will not require any authentication. So welcome home. Now I'm going to copy this and just put that in the dashboard, and we'll just change this to private dashboard. And let's also copy that and we put that in the login page here, and let's just say login. So let's go back to our application here. We have to run npm run dev, and here we should see our home page. If I just say / dashboard, we go to the private dashboard, which I need to correct a little bit, private with a T. So we go to the private dashboard. I can also go to login. And these routes are all very public right now. Now, while we are here, actually, let's go to the layout and put in at least a little navigation bar just so we can show things and hide them when necessary. Again, if you come to the Bootstrap View site here, you can see there's an example of a nav bar, which we are basically going to copy over and make a few changes. So let's say we're placing the nav bar here. And just by saving that nav bar, if I go back to the Nuxt application, we should see we have a nav bar showing up there. And I'm just going to make a class of margin bottom 4. And because we are using Nuxt, we can simply just say to use the Nuxt router here. And we want that brand name to go to the home page. So Nuxt Auth. I'll just name that Nuxt Auth. And we should see that going to the home page. Let's add a couple more links here, which we are going to be using to show and hide depending on the user's login state. So I'm just going to copy the right nav bar here. Again, this is just boilerplate HTML that we're putting in here, so we don't really need much from here. We're going to place a couple of links here. So I'm just going to call this one dashboard, and that will go to the dashboard page. Then I'm going to call this login, and that should go to the login page. Then I'm going to add a link here for logout. Let me put dashboard and logout together because they are going to be authenticated routes. And here just say logout. And the logout page will not be going to any page, it will just be an href, and go to pound and a click.prevent. We are going to call a logout method from our Nuxt component here. So I'm just going to get rid of all the styles in here as well. We don't need them, but we do need a script tag. So for now, this logout method will not do anything just yet, but let's just do a console log actually and see if we can get that message in our console here. So if I click on logout, I expect to see log, so that is working as expected. For now, that's what we need to do there. Let's go to our login page, and here we are going to quickly set up a data structure for our component. So I'm going to put the credentials in a form object, which will be the email. And here I'm just going to hard code the values because again, this is not going to be anything fancy, but that is the email that I provided when I registered the user on the API side, and the password, I'm just going to hard code them here as well. Then we do need a login method and login. So console.log, login as well. Now let's come back here. Instead of actually coming up with a whole form, I think I'm just going to go with a button here. I'm just going to say variant equals primary. So a primary button, and just call it login. And when the user clicks on that button, we want to call the login method in our component. So let's go back here and try to go to login. So if I do this, we should see login in our console. So let's quickly implement the login mechanism here using the Nuxt Auth Module. It's insanely easy to do the login from here. So here in our login method, we simply say this auth.login with, and with here it takes the provider that we are using to login. So here our provider was called Laravel Sanctum, and if we go back to Nuxt config, we can see that the strategy that we have here is called Laravel Sanctum. So that is the provider that we are passing here to the login with method. It takes the provider, but it also takes the data that we are sending through. So data here is this .form. So the data is basically what we entered here in the form. And that's all that you need to do to log the user in. So we can also just do a then here just to see if there's any response. Console.log the response, and let's also do a catch in case we have errors. So this is all we need to do for login here. Now let's go back, and one thing, if you look at here, we do have our Vuex store is empty at the moment, but the Nuxt Auth module actually saves your user object in a store module. So we need to activate Vuex to make sure that we can see what's going on in there when the user logs in, logs out. And to activate Vuex here is quite easy. All we need to do is go to the store folder here and create an index.js file. And that's all we need to do here to activate the store. So if I come back here, refresh, and we look at our store is now showing up here. And in the state here, we do have an auth module. And in the auth module, there's a logged in entry, which is false at the moment because we are not logged in. There's a strategy, which is Laravel Sanctum, and the user is null. Now let's try to log the user in here and see what happens. So I'm just going to clear everything here, and let's issue a login request. So login, and we do see that the login was actually successful. It was successful because it established a Laravel session, and it actually set the cross-site request forgery token in our cookies as well. And if we go to the Vuex store and we refresh our state, we now see that logged in is true and the user is showing up here in our store. And we can directly access this user object in the store. To access this, let's just go back to our dashboard, and instead of saying welcome, we can just say welcome B, and let's just access the user auth user.name. Save that. And if we go back to the dashboard, now we can access the user by the name or any credentials that we want in there. So this makes it incredibly easy already to do anything with your authentication. In fact, this has handled everything that you should have had to do manually, and it should have taken quite some time to get this configured, set up, and having all of this registered globally so you can access them even in templates. But we are not done quite yet, because if you look at here, I'm just going to remove this for now just because it's going to throw errors for the next thing that we're going to do here. But if we look at what's happening here, if I try to go to the login page, it still allows me to go to the login page. This should not happen. Now let's implement the logout, and we also see what happens when the user is logged out. To log out, it's even easier than logging the user in. And we did have our logout, I think, in layouts and in the navigation. So the method is in here in the logout. So to log out, all we need to do is just say this, auth, logout. And that's all you need to do. Of course, you could do this in a try catch block. Put this in here. Let's make this asynchronous. I think that would be okay. And console.log the error in case there is an error. So that is the logout function here. So if I come back here and I just click on logout, we are logged out. We are redirected to the home page, which is what we set in our configuration. But more importantly, if we come to our Vuex store here, the login now is set to false, the user is set to false, and we can tap into that to perform any authentication that we want in the front end. So let's quickly talk about middleware. The Nuxt Auth Module comes with a couple of middleware to check your authentication state. We are currently logged out of the system. So if I come here and I do dashboard, I can still access the dashboard. It's supposed to be private. So logged in here is false, but I can see the dashboard. So we need to be able to protect this with middleware. We also want to hide the links for dashboard and logout here if the user is not logged in, and to hide the login button if the user is already logged in. So let's do all of that now. Here we know that the dashboard and the logout buttons need to only be visible to users who are logged in. So here I'm just going to create a template, and I'm going to say if auth.logged in. And I wrap that in there. Again, auth.logged in coming from our store here. So we see there's a logged in value in the store. So as long as this is false, we will not see those links, and we are not seeing them here. And of course, we need to do the reverse for the login route. So template, vers, we show the login. So that's all we need to do to hide and show things by just checking the authentication state of the user. Of course, this doesn't prevent the user from just saying dashboard and going to the dashboard from here. And if they go to the login and they click login, now they are logged in, they can see the dashboard and they can see the logout buttons. Let's now implement the middleware to ensure that users are not able to visit pages that are private if they are not logged in. Now, like I mentioned, the module comes with a couple of middleware, and the authentication middleware in this module can be implemented in two ways. You can implement it globally, meaning that if you wanted all your pages in the application to be protected and only be accessed by logged in users, then you can simply set that middleware in your Nuxt config here under a router key or a router entry. So if I do router and I say middleware auth, now just by doing this, I should not be able to access any page if I'm not logged in. So if I try to go to the home page, it will bring me back to the login page. If I try to go to the dashboard, it will also bring me back to the login. So by specifying your auth middleware in the Nuxt config, you're protecting the entire application, and only the login page or the login route will be accessible. Now, this doesn't mean that you cannot exclude some pages from this. If you wanted the home page, for instance, to still be accessible to everybody, you can simply come to the home page here, or to any page that you want to exclude from that global authentication state, and you simply set a property called auth, set the value to false. So if I say auth false, then now I should be able to go to the home page with no problems, because I've explicitly told the module not to check for authentication on this page, that this is a public page. This is if you're actually trying to use the authentication middleware globally in the application. For most applications, we really want to only protect certain routes. So to protect specific routes in your application, what you need to do is simply go to that route, let's say the dashboard, meaning that we are not going to put the middleware in the Nuxt config, but we are going to put it on each page that requires authentication. So here in my dashboard, for instance, I can just say middleware auth. And if I do that, I can come back here. I should not be able to access the dashboard again. If I try to access the dashboard, it will kick me out and bring me to the login page. But I can still go to the home page because I haven't specified that middleware there, and the middleware is not specified globally. So if you want to protect individual pages, then you would just have to go to that page and set the middleware property of that component to auth. Now, one thing that we see here is that even though this works, we don't really have a guest middleware to protect on individual route basis. So the guest middleware that comes with this package works if you are protecting the application globally. So if you're putting the authentication in your Nuxt config file. But if you're doing it on a component by component basis, then the guest middleware or the guest property doesn't work as much. You need to create your own middleware for the guest property and apply that middleware just like you apply it here in the auth module. So to create middleware again here in Nuxt, it's really easy. It's a piece of cake. We already have a middleware folder that's created or that comes with Nuxt when you install it. So all we need to do here is create the middleware file, guest.js in this case. So we want to create a middleware for guests so that if a user is logged in, they should not be able to visit or to see the login page again. So all we need to do here is just create a file in the middleware folder, and the name of the file becomes the name of the middleware. So in this case, guest will become the name of our middleware. And here we can say export default. Let's just pull in the app, which is the Nuxt instance, and we pull redirect from the router. And all we need to do here is check to see if the logged in value of the auth module is true. So if app.auth.loggedin, so if the user is logged in, then we want to redirect them to the home page. So that's all we need to do to get the guest middleware working. So we're just saying that we're checking to see if the user is logged in, and if they are, we simply redirect them to the home page. Otherwise, of course, it will just continue as is. I'm getting a squiggly line here because this should actually be an arrow function. So that's all we need to do for the guest middleware. And if you can create as many middleware here as you need and apply them to your pages. And you can put multiple middleware on a single page. So by doing this, I can come here to the login page. Let's just check to see what's happening now. So here I can say login. I'm now logged in, but I can still go to the login page by entering the URL here. So that's what we want to avoid. So by applying that middleware, we should be redirected. So let's say middleware. And here, let's say guest. So if I come back here, I refresh, and I try to go to the login page. Because I'm authenticated, it will kick me out and bring me back to the home page. So it will never allow me access that login page as long as I am logged in. But if I log out and I go back to the login page, I can access it again. And if you look at the difference here, I put this in an array. So you can pass multiple middleware to a single page. So you can see here that I'm able to log in. And when I'm logged in, I can no longer visit the guest route, which in this case is just the login route. But I can go to my dashboard, which is private, and I can also log out. But if I log out, then I can go to the login page again, which means our middleware is working quite well. Now, one thing that I want to draw your attention to again is this is really smart. You know, if you're working with Laravel and Blade, generally when you try to access an authenticated page and you're kicked out, Laravel kind of saves that page in your session under the intended flag, right? Now, when you eventually log in, you're immediately redirected to the page you intended going to before. And that's the same thing here. If you look at, let me try to go to dashboard here, which is an authenticated page. I'm redirected to the login page. But more importantly, if we come to the cookies here, we do have an entry for auth redirect and it says dashboard. So the module actually saves the intended URL in the cookies. And when I finally log in, like if I log in here, it will immediately redirect me to that route. So if I log in, I'm taken to my dashboard and that cookie value is cleared out. So this is a really smart way to organize things. And you can see that it takes tons of work out of the user himself. Again, we can come back to the dashboard here and we can just say auth user name. So if I come back, we do have welcome John showing up here as expected. So again, if you are looking to work with Laravel and Nuxt and you're planning to host both your Nuxt and your APIs on the same domain, this is the best way to go. You're using a first-party package from Laravel, so you're working within the Laravel ecosystem, and you don't have to maintain any JWT authentication tokens in the front end or anything like that. You're working within sessions, and there's a lot of benefit that comes with working with sessions if you can successfully connect your front end and your back end that way. This is just one of the providers, as I mentioned. If we go back here, you can see there's more providers in this auth module, and Laravel is really being favored here quite a lot because we do have providers for JWT Laravel and we have for Passport and Sanctum, which we just did. So we are just touching on the Sanctum in this video, but I'm going to be looking at other authentication or these other providers in other videos. So if you like this video, please click on the subscribe button, subscribe to the channel so that you get notified when I upload any new video for this and other lessons. The entire source code for this project is in GitHub and the link is in the description below, as well as the links to the Auth Module and Laravel Sanctum and some of the useful links that you may need for this lesson. So please click on subscribe and I'll see you in the next video.